Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of STEAM Shorts. I'm Allison Morgan. I'm the Georgia Department of Education STEAM Program Specialist that works directly with First District RESA, region, and schools. I recorded a quick video introducing this professional learning series that I'm calling STEAM Shorts, and I would love for you to check it out if you haven't already. So the first episode, we're going to be talking about instructional strategies. And when I talk with educators, I often hear this. I'm really bought into this idea of STEM and STEAM, but then I'm asked a follow-up question of, but what does instruction look like in a STEM-STEAM classroom? What are some instructional strategies that I can use? So today I'm going to share a few of those ideas. First, I want to make sure that we highlight some of the characteristics of a STEM-STEAM approach to teaching and learning to ensure that we all start from the same understanding and ideas about this pedagogy. This is not every characteristic that I would attribute to STEM and STEAM, but the three we're going to talk about today are student-centered, authenticity, and that learning is driven by inquiry. So first, learning is student-centered. And a common misconception here is that student choice or decisions that come with student-centered learning means that they aren't learning the required content or curriculum. But as teachers, we set the parameters or the settings for students and their learning and give enough choice and voice for that learning to be student-centered within the concepts and the context that we want them to learn about and in. So for instance, you may set up a learning experience to introduce the idea of constructive and destructive forces by sharing images and using a protocol called See, Think, Wonder. In this protocol, you would ask students to view the images and look at what they see in the pictures, what they think is happening, and what they wonder or question from looking at the pictures. You could give them guidance on what you want them to look for and simple definitions of the terms if you wanted. But the difference here is that instead of making it a teacher-centered activity where you show them the pictures or you actively go over the definitions and tell them about these terms and point out this information, instead, students are engaged in inquiry and they're doing the work to learn about these terms actively instead of passively. The next thing is that when possible, we're attaching authenticity and context to learning. So if we take that same example of constructive and destructive forces, teachers may want to use their specific geographical region to represent those terms. I live in Savannah, so we could use beach erosion and the impact of hurricanes on Tybee Island as part of the understanding of that term. And this gives students something that they have experienced or seen or generally know about to attach to that concept. In the image on the slide, students were engaged in a project learning about energy and ultimately making recommendations to their community about energy efficient decisions, having that authenticity and that context attached to those fifth grade standards. The third characteristic we're talking about, we've kind of already hit on and not directly named, is that learning is driven by inquiry. Again, I don't mean that students can create some sort of learning tangent because they're curious and now that takes over the required course content, but rather you as a teacher are creating an opportunity for students to ask questions and for curiosity to spark as a result of how you're presenting that material. In the previously mentioned strategy, See, Think, Wonder, including the wonder part creates that curiosity and supports students' ability to ask questions. Questions can be difficult for students, and so one thing you may need to do while you're teaching students how to ask questions is to provide something like sentence stems to support that process. So we just went over three important characteristics that I use to define a STEM-STEAM approach to learning, that it's student-centered, authentic, and inquiry-based. I wove in one example of a protocol or a strategy that you could use with students called See, Think, Wonder, and I also talked about question stems or sentence stems that may help scaffold some of this learning for your students. But let's look at a few more. So I came across this resource from Facing History, and I'm going to link this below the video. Last spring, and I heard a lot of good feedback as I shared it with educators. What I like about this is that it starts with what you want students to do. So on the left, you can see connect, reflect, inquire, and discuss. you can easily attach those actions to the verbs of your standards so that you're thinking about the right protocol or strategy to align with the depth of thinking required in the standard. The second thing I really like about this resource is that it gives you a way to think about that action in 3 ways. Synchronous, so all together at the same time. Asynchronous, that students are engaged in the same activity at different times. And offline, which does not require any technology. As schools start with various plans, and as plans are changing, some of which include virtual learning, I want to encourage you that not all of the virtual learning has to be dependent on technology. So I really like how this chart shares ways for you to engage in learning away from the traditional classroom without a device. As you're viewing these different strategies, I want you to think about this. How do these strategies transform students from being passive recipients of information to active learners? That's really the key when we start thinking about a student-centered classroom or student-centered learning. You as the educator set up a scenario or an experience for students to engage in with the structure of a protocol, and you're there to facilitate that learning. The last thing I'll point out in this resource is that the strategies offer you a structured way to give the power back to the students for it to be student-centered. As a classroom teacher, I personally would sometimes set up a scenario and then expect my kids to discuss. And if I didn't have that structured strategy with it, it wasn't as successful. The discussion always had more impact and students were more engaged when I used a strategy like think, pair, share, or big paper silent conversation. The last thing is, don't be afraid to change the strategy to better meet the needs of you and your students. I would often use a think, pair, share, but I would make it a think, write, pair, share to add in that explicit step of formulating the thoughts that you brainstormed in the think section. Put your own spin on it and know that changing things up like this also helps with the novelty and increases engagement with your students. So ultimately, these student-centered strategies are the ways that teachers can facilitate those key characteristics and get at the heart of what a STEM classroom looks like on a day-to-day basis. Instructional strategies are my favorite topic. I could go on and on and on, but I hope this was helpful in starting to think about what a STEM classroom looks like and how it really is rooted in those student-centered instructional strategies. If you want to go deeper in this topic, please feel free to reach out to me. And if you have another idea for an extension of this episode or something different, or you're willing to showcase some strategies that you have facilitated with students, please let me know. I would love to have you do that. Thanks, everybody.